Hello, folks. It's Michael with the ccerp podcast, Cypress Creek Ecological Restoration Project. Hope you're doing well. Um, Today, we have on the show Tom Helm to talk about the geology of our area. So, without further ado, Tom, can you say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. This is Tom Helm. I'm a local geologist here in the Houston area, and I also spend a lot of time going down Buffalo Bayou and some of their local waterways.
Cool. And you give tours, right?
Yeah, I started a little side business, guiding canoe trips mainly on Buffalo Bayou. Something I always wanted to do, and decided to do it. Had some boats, and so yeah, do trips all the way down. From as far upstream as Highway 6, and we come all the way to downtown. We'll even do below downtown. Mainly looking at a lot of geology and our various wildlife and ecology of the bayou, which is far more interesting than I think anybody really ever realized until pretty recently.
Yeah. Like, how so?
Well, there's quite a lot out there. There's a lot of exposed rock outcrops, a lot of big mature trees, a lot of wildlife, a lot of natural springs that flow out of the sides of the rocks there, and we've got a population of alligator snapping turtles.
Nice.
And beavers. So yeah, it's this really cool wildlife refuge right in the middle of the city.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah, I guess that's one thing that's happened. Unfortunately, in the direction the culture has gone, people have lost touch with nature, too caught up in human society. So it's just like a bunch of people in a small town that have kind of become ignorant of the outside world and kind of prejudiced, so to speak, and just because they lost sight of it, not like as an insult there, but just a comparison. But kind of lost touch with nature and just too much involved in human society, and kind of like being maybe a primitive person in a little village that never goes anywhere and thinks that that's the whole world. But we need to.
Well,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it almost seems like it's almost the opposite in this situation, because you have this giant city that has formed all around Buffalo Bayou, and people ignore what's right there in our backyard. They just think, oh, it can't be that great because it's right here, or it's a drainage ditch, or it's dirty, or whatever. And so, we have all this. There are all these people that live here that, are claim to be outdoorsmen and such, and they go on trips to all these far-flung places and put them on Instagram or Facebook about how they went to Costa Rica or something, or the Colorado mountains or something. And it's like, wait a minute, we have this really great wildlife destination right in your backyard, and people don't believe it. They sometimes refuse to believe it. They don't want to be told that that's there. So
that's a good point. I forgot about that. Yeah, I know. People have said that. I know through the years, someone goes to Los Angeles and they live there, and instead of right away taking advantage of visiting some of the movie places and going to see some old silent movies in some of the old theaters, it's like, oh, it's there. I can go anytime. Why should I go?
Right.
It's
right. Yeah.
Every city. It's like, if it's there, can be a tendency to ignore it. Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting thing too. I think it's like both. There's that general aspect of our culture. Thankfully, some people are realizing the importance of nature and starting to bring it back into our culture more generally, because it's always been there to some extent. But
and a lot of it's recognizing what's not only the existence of nature, but what nature is available right within our grasp. And we have green space right in our city that is now that biologists or things are starting to document what's here. It's remarkable just how much we have still existing, and there's a real need to preserve these spaces so that people can experience them for themselves without having to spend hundreds of dollars for a plane ticket or, drive for hours and hours to some place to go see something. They can just walk out of their backyard or back door and walk across the street to a park and see 100 different species of birds if they just open their eyes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's amazing. Like you don't got to go up north to see bald eagle and beaver. You can just go around here and enjoy.
That's right. They're right here. Yeah. So.
And thank goodness, river otter are making a comeback in the local area.
That's true. They've people have been seeing them in Buffalo Bayou, and I think some of the other bayous also.
Yeah, up here on Cypress Creek. Yeah, thank goodness. But so where did you go to school, and how have you studied geology? What's your background in that?
So I wasn't always planning to be a geologist. I didn't grow up in Houston. I grew up over near New Orleans, and I was really more of I've always been interested in science, life sciences in particular, and so I was originally in the pre-med program at up at University of Mississippi, and for a number of reasons it didn't work out. Maybe I had too much fun there or something, but I left there and came to University of Houston. I moved to Houston and went to University of Houston to try to figure out what to do, and took a geology class, and just immediately I realized that this is what I liked doing and I was good at it. And, the thing was, I didn't realize you could do it professionally. I didn't realize it was a job,
Yeah.
And so, being in the Houston area, I saw it like, oh, wait a minute, this is actually a really good profession to be in. So, so I went ahead and changed my major and, finished my bachelor's degree, and then went to grad school, and then became employed in the oil and gas industry, and it's been that way ever since. And so, but it's, during that time period, we did a lot of field trips around Texas and New Mexico, and then I was always trying to get people, because I started noticing when I would go canoeing on Buffalo Bayou, because I was doing canoe racing at the time.
Cool.
I saw rock outcrops. I saw these rock outcrops in the bayou, and I was like, wait a minute, there's actually some real sandstone there, and you can see features in that sandstone, and why isn't anybody doing any work on this stuff? And I kind of suggested it to various professors, like, hey, you know what, let's do some field work on this Buffalo Bayou sandstone. And I get the pushback I would get would be sort of like what I was talking about earlier, where nobody thought it was exotic enough. It's not in some far off exotic location. It's just right here. It can't be important. There's no way it could be possibly significant. And so, it was just sort of like, okay, great. And, yeah. So, but yeah, so that's pretty much what I've been doing. And so I've been doing this geology profession for the last 25 years or so.
Cool.
And just in the last 4 years, that's when I decided now that I had some time to do it, I focused on actually doing some geology studies on Buffalo Bayou. And so, it's in a very basic phase right now, but I think there's more work to be potentially done. It's just a matter of finding the time and the funding to make it happen.
And so before we go on with all that, so you have a PhD in geology from UH or master's?
No. So I have a bachelor's for sure. And I did my master's coursework, did my research, wrote a thesis, but never quite got the final sign off on all that. And that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah. Politics.
But yeah, it's just, although if you go to the UH, University of Houston geology website, they have me listed on there as having a master's degree. So I don't know what there's, because anyway, it's like, I guess for all intents and purposes, I have one, but I don't have the piece of paper, So I have considered going back to school to get a PhD. It's just it hasn't really worked out yet from various standpoints.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Darwin didn't have a PhD in evolutionary biology either, but who cares?
Right. And before he gets talking about the politics of academics, it's like, okay, well, somebody has a PhD. It's like, okay, well, that means they went through all the academic politics to get there, does it really mean that they're actually more qualified than somebody who doesn't have one? You know, I think that's a fair open question, you know, that there are PhDs that maybe aren't as well-rounded on some certain areas that people who don't have them might be.
I'm in education, so I know all about that, and I'm all over that. I talk about that in this other podcast I do. Or like, go back in time, Ptolemy would have been considered to have a PhD in astronomy at his time, but he was wrong.
Yeah. So, yeah.
But cool. And was there anything like when you were younger that got you interested in like the outdoors, or would have maybe led you to be interested in geology later that you can think of, or?
Yeah, well, so where I grew up, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in the New Orleans area, but it was not in New Orleans proper. We lived on a piece of property actually in Mississippi, just close to the Louisiana border, right along the beachfront there, in a small town called Pass Christian, which it's been over 10 years now, but they were one of the little towns that was pretty much leveled by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. But it was a great little town to grow up in. It was maybe 2,000 people, and it was right on the beachfront. We were a block off the beach, and so I would go. There wasn't much to do in this small town as a you know, somebody who is in their preteen days. So I would go to the beach all the time, and you know, we'd go fishing I remember being down there, and I got really interested in watching how the water moved the sand around. So look at the sandbars and see the different patterns that the different ripple forms that would be created by water moving in different directions. And so I really started observing that and really got interested in it, but I didn't think that it had any kind of real applicability to, you know, anything later on. And then I remember taking a few trips with my dad to the Texas Hill Country when I was probably 12 years old. And that was the first time I saw a real rock outcrop. And I thought, oh man, look at that, rocks. It really excited me, and I didn't understand why. And
makes sense.
I guess growing up in a swampy beach area, you know, we don't see rocks there, you know, just something different.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess I always had kind of this innate interest in it. And plus, I'd dig up fossils in the driveway and the gravel and things. I was really interested in that too. Cool. So yeah, I guess I was born to be a geologist. I just didn't know it until I was 24 years old, you know, so.
Yeah. But yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, I remember, you know, being younger and going different places and, yeah, being all excited. Like, I think the family went to Bandera, some dude ranch thing out there when I was young, and we're all excited about the dinosaur tracks and the rocks, and I've always loved the hills and mountains a lot more than the beach. It's just so much more visually exciting and interesting, and the terrain is so much more interesting to me than like the to me the boring flat, pretty much featureless beach.
Well, and yeah, I mean, and you're right about that, about beaches being sort of, when you first see them, it could be featureless and flat, and kind of what I mentioned earlier, when you start really looking at the waves and you start seeing how the water interacts with the sand, and you start thinking, okay, where'd this sand come from? And you know, pretty much all sand comes from erosion and crumbling of larger rocks from somewhere else. And so what you do is take a handful of that sand and start looking at it. And when you start looking at the different grains and what are the grains shaped like, what color are they, what minerals are they, and that sand will tell you a story of where it came from.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow.
So you can tell, and it's no matter where you are in the world, if there's sand, you can figure out like, oh, well, this sand was derived from these kinds of rocks. And then you start to think, where did they come? There's a river close by here that brought down gravel from a mountain range 100 miles away, or they're mountains right there that have rocks that are right here that are being broken down right on site here, or they come from a coral reef that's offshore. And so that you can tie it all together. And when you start digging in, of course, you know, when I start telling people this at the beach or you know, wherever, about a minute into it, everybody sorts of glaze over, you know, like, oh, well, what you're, you know,
Yeah.
like, oh, what are you doing, man? You know, it's like, so, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, but I don't know, kind of maybe partly the world we live in today, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's that. You're right.
But yeah, it just depends on the time. Because I think in ancient Greece, people were curious, and you had a bunch of different cultures coming together, so there was a lot of thought and curiosity, and we'd have to put it more in context. But I've heard that at the markets, people would always be discussing things like why this and why that, and things about philosophy, and you know, of course, philosophy then was like everything. Philosophy, as we call it, as well as like natural history and physics and astronomy and math, and they'd be talking about all kinds of things at the market, and you know, we don't do that at the supermarket today.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, I mean, you think about back then, there were no TVs, there were no cell phones, there were no radio stations, and so it was a lot less distracting as far as what's out there, and you know, no cars, so you know, you lived in the probably 1 square mile that you lived in your whole life, and so you know, everything around you was, you could focus on everything that was there, and you know, there were no power tools, so if you wanted to build something, you had to do it by hand, and you know, so you were able to examine things much more in depth, you know, and I guess where people got into trouble is when they tried to come up with explanations for things that, you know, why is something the way it is? Well, then you come up with a reason, or somebody, you know, somebody with some power or authority would say, well, this is why it is. And then everybody said, oh, okay, well, that answers that question. And so that's where, you know, you get these sort of incorrect beliefs going, or it was created by the gods, you know, or it's, you know, it was created by this, you know, this ancient giant race of giants that came along, and they did this, you know, did this thing, or got in a fight and built, that's why this pile of rocks is here, you know. And so, yeah, so everybody's always had you know, it's fun to create stories and have a fanciful idea of things like that. But when you don't have movies and TVs and video games in front of you, the human mind will create, you know, and we'll examine. And so back in times like ancient Greece, or any time in that, you know, 1,000 years ago, before any of that existed, you know, there were, you know, think about all the really cool art and science that came out of that time period.
Yeah.
People could focus.
Yeah, a lot of different factors creating the difference. We got some good things going on nowadays, but of course there's also some like not so good things.
Yeah, well, that's another topic we could probably spend hours talking about. So.
Yeah. But so before we get into talking about some of the local geology, let's like step back and look at the general area, maybe talk a little bit about the geology of Texas. So what are some of the geological features around Texas, and what are some of the oldest rocks, and what's like a brief geologic history of Texas in general?
Okay. Well, let's see.
There is no brief answer.
Yeah, that's okay. So, without getting too long-winded here, so as far back as in the Precambrian, I can't remember exactly. There have been a couple of different episodes of continent and plate tectonic collisions and things that have involved the Texas area.
And when was the Precambrian?
What's that?
When was the Precambrian?
So the Cambrian was the first geological period where there's definite evidence of life, on Earth. So it's when you had hard organisms and things, or fossils are present in the rock record. And excuse me, and that's about 600 million years ago.
Okay.
Now, in more recent times, paleontologists have found evidence of older life in rocks that are older than 600 million years old. So things like, more as methods of looking at old rocks have improved, you start to see evidence of soft organisms or single cell organisms that are much older than that. But for the terminology of the from geology time periods, you have the Cambrian is that first one at 600 million years. Now, the Earth is, I think, the age of the Earth is believed to be around 4.5 billion years.
Mm-hmm.
So, 600 million, and with 4.5 billion, that gives you, over 3 billion years, almost 3.5 billion years of time prior to the Cambrian, and that things were happening on this Earth. And so that's quite a bit of time. So the oldest rocks in Texas that I guess that I know of are around the Enchanted Rock area, Fredericksburg. There's a string of granite hills that run through there. And those, because of the size of the crystals, if you go to Enchanted Rock and you walk around out there, you can see these the quartz crystals and the feldspar crystals that are in those rocks are really big, and some of them are big as the size of footballs. And so when you have crystals that are that large in a granite, that means that it was buried very deeply and it spent a long time cooling. So that you only see that if that granite is deep in the bottom of a mountain range. And so the current line of thinking is that at some point in the past, 3 billion years ago, there was a mountain range that ran through the middle of Texas that was similar in size to the Himalayas, because it would have been a continent collision, similar to what is right now in India and Asia. So now, was it as big as the Himalayas? We don't know. But it certainly would have been probably pretty impressive when you have continents running into each other. Yeah. So that string of granite, and you see it in other parts of the country too. So you can trace that boundary through Texas and into, it's believed to be part of this orogeny that you can track the pattern of all the way through up into the Ozarks and into the eastern part of the U.S. But it's cool. Been one of those conjectural things that we all kind of go with it. There's not as much proof as we'd like for it to be, but there's no other good explanation. So it's like, okay, well, we'll call it that for now. Yeah. So yeah. So you can go there and you can see these rocks that are 3 billion years old.
Wow.
In other parts of Texas, there are some rocks that aren't quite that old, but they're ancient. Like in the, I guess in West Texas, there's some Ordovician age dolomites.
How old is that?
And the and you're asking that. I don't have my time scale in front of me.
I'll put something. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so there was
but I'll put something on the show notes for folks. Yeah, you can check out the time scale and look it up while you're listening if you can.
Right. So, right. Yeah.
Okay, folks, we're back. I had some technical difficulties. My Skype credit ran out, so the call got shut down. So I replenished my credit, so we are back talking to Tom. The fun, joys, and interesting little things about podcasting. So, could you continue for us, Tom, please?
Sure. Yeah. So we're talking about some various rocks around Texas. So we have this. There's a rock formation in West Texas called the Ellenberger, which is a dolomite rock, and it was it's a little bit younger than those Cambrian age rocks. It's around 450 million years old. So and then I'm not gonna give you an exhaustive list of every single rock in Texas, but just to give you an idea of how much of a range we have. So we have that, and then we have some Permian age rocks in also West Texas out there near Guadalupe Mountains State Park, which has Guadalupe Peak, which is the tallest point in Texas out there. That's Permian age limestone. And so Permian, that's about 250 million years ago. And so, and then some of the rocks in Big Bend which is just south from there, there's some rocks from that age period there. And then also in Big Bend, then you start to get into some of the Cretaceous rocks that we have all around central parts of Texas. And that's in the 100 million to 65 million year range. So whenever you're driving through, say, around there west of Austin or along I-10 there, west of San Antonio, and you're driving through all this white, chalky-looking limestone, that's all Cretaceous age. And you mentioned Bandera earlier. There's some outcrops around Bandera, and that Uvalde, I guess it's north of Uvalde in there. And there's a bunch of limestone and with dinosaur tracks and such.
How old is
the dinosaur tracks?
Yeah.
So they're Cretaceous. I can't remember exactly what part of the Cretaceous that they're from. But somewhere between, I think they're not Upper Cretaceous. I think they're somewhere in the middle range. So probably around 80 million years old. So wow. Relatively young compared to Enchanted Rock. But still 80 million years. I mean, that's a long, long, long time. You know?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. What about up around, what is that area? There's those beautiful canyons in North Texas, 2 parks up there close together. Forgot their name.
Palo Duro?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how old that sandstone is. I think it may be Triassic or a little bit older. So Triassic was after the Permian. So Permian being 200 million years or so, 250. I'd have to go back and look. I'm not super familiar with that part of Texas up there. But they're old. I mean, they're in the Mesozoic age, which is so I've been throwing out all these time periods. So you've got the what's called the Phanerozoic, which is the time of the geologic time scale that life has been documented. So that starts at the Cambrian and goes all the way to the present day. And so that Phanerozoic is divided up into 3 large stages: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And so the Paleozoic to Mesozoic boundary is from the Permian to the Triassic. And those boundaries are marked generally by some big change in the observed fossil fauna that's in those rocks. And so the Permian to Triassic boundary is marked by this massive extinction event that wiped out 95% of life as observed, and that we've seen in the fossil record. So wow. Something very, very cataclysmic happened at that time period to wipe everything out.
Was that
and then the same?
Was that the meteor in the Yucatan?
Well, no. That's the boundary between the Cretaceous to the Paleocene. So that would be the Mesozoic to Cenozoic boundary. Is the Chicxulub one. The one that happened back in the Permian Triassic boundary, we don't really know what caused that. Whether it was another sort of, whether it was a meteorite strike or some kind of, the big climate shift or something. What is also noted in that time period is that was when the Triassic was suddenly like there was a lot of desert around at least every place where we've got rocks. There were a lot of red beds. So the surface of the earth at that time, at least parts of it, may have resembled something like what you see in outback Australia right now, with a lot of red sand everywhere, or surface of Mars, where you have just a lot of desert. And then as at the end of that time, or during that time, or at the end of Triassic, that's when Pangea existed. So that was we had a Earth supercontinent. So the continents were breaking up after that time. So then you had more coastline, and I guess climate patterns changed when you have multiple different oceans and ocean circulation happening. It's all tied together in a big complex system. But depending on how your ocean circulation works around your continent distribution, that completely changes Earth's climate. And so, like for instance, right now, our continent distribution around the world is pretty spread out. We've got, the Eurasian landmass is all together, and then Africa is snuggled up right there to it also. But you also have North and South America on the far side of the planet. So you have two big main ocean basins that have north to south, cold, warm, cold. So it generates this big ocean circulation. So it keeps the planet's temperature reasonably stable. But if you can imagine, if you had just one big landmass, or if it was concentrated, in one north side or the south side of the Earth, then you'd have your ocean circulation pattern would be completely different.
Interesting.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
So if folks want to deal with the problem of any change in climate, then they need to just move the continents.
Right. Yeah. That's it. That's all you got to do.
Funny. But, and as I say, if folks look at, in some of the show notes, we'll put a link to some of the time, like periods in the names, and it'll help you kind of grasp what's going on when. Could be like a lot of complicated names to kind of make sense of, since we're not used to it. But Tom is just fine with it, but the rest of us might need to look at something to let it sink in and kind of hold our hand.
Sure. And I have to look at those things all the time too. I mean, it's a really, there's a whole lot of jargon. There's lots to remember. That's why we keep a library of reference books. So I can always go back and check to make sure that, I think that's why a lot of people get turned off by some of the sciences. I mean, geology, for example, because there is so much jargon to remember, and time scales, and so it's never you can never be expected to remember it all in your head just off the top. It's like there's nothing wrong with going back and looking at a reference. So yeah. But I was gonna to finish you were asking about ages of rocks. I was kind of working my way up to younger rocks.
Oh, cool.
And so Cretaceous rocks. That's okay. That Cretaceous period, the end of the Mesozoic, that ended at about 65 million years ago. That's kind of the handy number that gets batted around. And so in Texas, at least, once you get into now the Cenozoic period, so that's the earliest part of that was called the Paleocene, and then you get into the Eocene, and then after the Eocene is the Miocene, and then the Pliocene and Pleistocene. And so all of those periods in the Cenozoic have rocks exposed in Texas, and most of them all exist in mostly like the relatively southeast part of Texas. So along that Balcones escarpment, it's Austin, San Antonio, Del Rio, I guess Fort Worth. There's that topographic feature in central Texas. When you're east of that, you're all into the Cenozoic rocks, and when you're west of that, you're on the Cretaceous platform. And so it's marked by this escarpment there. And so when all the rocks southeastward, you have all the Cenozoic rocks exposed. So you have Eocene rocks, and there's a formation in Texas called the Wilcox that is Eocene in age, and it's really famous in Texas because it produces a lot of oil and gas. So and so then there's also a lot of outcrop exposed. So it's a really good geological landmark. And then you get some Miocene rocks exposed to which is the next age up from the Eocene. And there's a belt of those rocks exposed southeastward from there, and then after that you get into the Pliocene and Pleistocene, and so you have some outcrops of those rocks around, and that's getting even closer to us. So the rocks you see in Buffalo Bayou are all Pleistocene, which is around 1 million years or less. And so the ones you see in Buffalo Bayou are actually much, much younger than anything in the rest of Texas. And there's some debate about how old exactly they are. And right now we're trying to decide whether or not they're as young as 75,000 years old, or could they be as old as 100,000, 200,000 years,
Wow.
which is still a really long time. That's the thing. But they're hard rocks. I mean, they're, you can hit them with a hammer and they, tap, 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 and it's, they won't just crumble in your hands. And so, and then around the area, you also find, like on the, you can go in the sandbars in the Brazos River and the Colorado River and find, mammoth teeth and fragments of bones from different mammals and things like that. Yeah. So
cool.
And those are from only maybe 10,000 years ago. But they've lived and died in the swamps and prairies of Southeast Texas up until about 10,000 years. And then as they've died and their bones get buried in mud, and the rivers track across the prairie, they expose those bones and they get worked into the gravel. And so they're there for everybody to look at.
Wow, interesting. And then another thing I just found for folks you could look at, TexasAlmanac.com has a geologic map of Texas. It's pretty interesting. Shows how in West Texas there's all these different geological like rocks and formations, different time periods, and kind of in parts of central Texas, but then a lot of it you see this interesting gradual these bands going from like West Texas, from like southwest to northeast, these bands of geologically similar areas. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, and if you look at a map that shows the geology of the whole country, if it include Louisiana in there, Mississippi, and some of their stuff, you'll see that at least the rocks we have down here on the Texas Gulf Coast plain, where I was talking earlier about the Eocene, Miocene, Pleistocene transitions, you'll see those bands, and that what happened in the during the Cretaceous, there was some uplift over in the west side of the U.S. The Rocky Mountains came up, and so that all when you uplift some earth, and you drop rain on it, it immediately starts eroding, and so all that dirt and gravel that's coming off of those highlands is going to run downhill to where the water wants to go, and all that was coming straight toward us. So all this rock, all the last 60 million years of geology that we see from between here and Austin is all gravel and sand and everything that is eroded off of those high grounds and piled up down here, heading toward trying to fill up the Gulf of Mexico. And so, yeah.
So that ties back to what you said earlier about looking at the sand in an area and figuring out where it came from.
Right, exactly. So you can go along these different rivers all along the Gulf Coast and pick up a handful of sand and take a look at it, and you can see what grain kinds are in there, and it'll tell you something about where that river comes from, what area of mountains it drains, and it's different. I mean, you go along the whole Gulf Coast, and a guy did this actually. I remember when he back in the 1950s, a geologist went through and did this study and noted how the grains changed along the coast as you crossed each river. And so it gives you a picture of the contributions of various sand grains from the different highlands.
Interesting. And so the way it is, like, all the rivers have brought in the past erosion, all this stuff has come from the Rocky Mountains. Has there been some that have come from? Yeah, so I guess the Mississippi is too far east. So nothing really comes from like the eastern U.S. or the northern U.S. Everything here is from like the Rocky Mountains in the west.
Well, there is, so it's mostly from the west, but there is some contribution from, I guess there's the Mississippi River, even though it is quite far east, the prevailing nearshore current direction in the Gulf runs from east to west. So the reason like our beach water down in Galveston is so muddy is because all that fine silt from the Mississippi River is making its way over here. Plus, you've also got several other, I guess the Sabine River and that contributes some sediment too, but the Mississippi is the big muddy. So you get some sediment from the river coming all the way over here. Now that's in modern times. In ancient times, say back in the Eocene, you have the Appalachian foothills that run all the way through North Mississippi and kind of, die out when you get through over to Memphis and such. But then you get the Ozark foothills picking up in Louisiana, and then you have Arkansas right there in North Texas, and then there's the Arbuckles in North Texas. And so there are high grounds up there that are older mountain ranges in the Rockies. The Ozarks and Arbuckle, those are more, those are older rocks. They're older mountain ranges. And so there is a contribution of sand from those highlands, but it's just not as voluminous, not as great of a volume of sediment coming down as it is coming from that northwestern direction.
Makes sense.
And if you look at the drainages of the different rivers, like for example, the Brazos River is a good example. Its headwaters is all the way up in New Mexico, and so so it's bringing material all the way down from up there, and so the reason we have so much red clay around here is because, or one of the reasons is we have red clay is that sand was eroded from all those red outcrops up in North Texas, that Palo Duro area, and which is, I think, Triassic, which would have been coming from that red beds, that Mars landscape that existed back then. And so all that's clay that came from all the way up there. So,
wow, interesting. But pretty much most of the sand, clay, and rock down here is from the Rocky Mountains, then eroded.
From that uplift, generally from that, so you have the Rocky Mountains proper, but then there's a bulge of high land, so it would have been from that topographic high. That's where most of it's coming from, that direction. That's correct.
Was it a greater contribution during the ice ages from erosion by glaciers, or was most of it from like water, rain and stuff like that, wind?
Probably a little bit of both. I mean, now the ice age glaciers would have scraped a bunch of material as they migrated down south, and then when there was when the glaciers melted back, there was huge volumes of water coming down the rivers, and so especially the Texas rivers because it was coming off of those. There were glaciers on the Rockies, and so you had water coming down. So the rivers are like the Brazos River and the Trinity River, and the San Jacinto River had much more volume going down. They were much bigger rivers back, during the earlier part of the Pleistocene because of all this water coming down. So you can actually look at, if you look at something like Google Earth and really, look at these big meander patterns that are associated with these rivers, and you can see the size of these big meander loops are much, much larger than the existing river could possibly make. So it had to be something. There was much bigger volume of water coming down those at some time in the fairly recent past.
Interesting. So how broad, like, are people able to determine how broad they think the river was at the time, or is it just you're not sure, or they don't know, or?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at that and you can see, individual channel, like the meander loops, and you can measure those and postulate, okay, well, it could have possibly been at least this wide. And I don't have that image in front of me right now, so I can't really throw out a number, but you can look at the Trinity River again on the satellite photos just north of Anahuac over there in North Galveston Bay. And you can see and since that basin, that Trinity River basin, all the way up to even Lake Livingston Dam is really pretty undeveloped. It still has lots of the natural forest still out there. You can really see the patterns. And so that's something maybe we can do when we meet to go down the bayou. I can show you some of those images, and we can talk about that.
Awesome.
At our next meeting. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so folks, hopefully we can have a video podcast thing and talk to Tom in person and actually show some of the rocks in Buffalo Bayou and discuss them and get some images up there and just focus on the Buffalo Bayou and talk about the maps and how wide things were at the time, rivers. But that'd be cool. But yeah, it's interesting. And so there's some general context for everybody about our geologic history. And then in our area, so you say we got some rocks that are maybe 1 million years old, but that's like debatable.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to be quite that old. I mean, right here in this Houston area, I think they're really more on the range of maybe 100,000 years old. You could get 1 million year old rocks not too far away, but you have to drive, up north of Conroe. I think there's some older rocks exposed up when you get up there. So that's and then when you get not too much further north and west from here, you get into you cross the Pliocene and into the Miocene. So you get into some 10 million year old rocks pretty quickly once you get up north of, say, like 2 hours north of Houston.
Wow.
Or drive out to Bastrop, and if you go out Highway 71 on between LaGrange and Bastrop, and you can see some outcrops of red sandstone around there, and that's all Eocene age. So it's Wilcox. So that's in the 20 million year range, 30 million years.
Wow.
But right here in town, if you happen to walk down Buffalo Bayou or canoe down Buffalo Bayou when the water's low, and you start seeing some sandstones that are actually hard, or some bedded firm red clays, those are all Pleistocene age, which best guess so far, best analysis that I've seen on this is that they're somewhere in the 100,000 to 200,000 year range.
Okay. And then that's what I've seen. Stuff on the internet. Some of the clay might be 250,000 years old, and then the sand on top of that came afterward. Right.
Yeah, and that the clay has an interesting interpreted story that so all that clay was it's part of this Brazos River Delta system, and during the ice ages we had several episodes of glacier advance and glacier retreat, and when the glaciers were at full maximum glaciation, there's evidence that sea level was as much as 400 feet lower than it is now.
Wow.
And so we, the coastline would have been 50 miles offshore from where it is now. And so all this Houston area, the bayous would have downcut and into the clays, and all that clay that had been deposited by, when the water sea level was higher, all that clay was exposed for thousands of years in a badlands type topography. And so the clay got desiccated, means dried out, and got really firm. And even though now the sea level is back up to where it is at a glacial minimum, all that you can see this clay exposed in the banks of the bayou, and it's really, it's you can break it up with your fingers, but it's really, really firm. So yeah, it looks to be what's called a desiccated clay.
Oh, huh. And then really quickly, in regard to the sea level being down, once upon a time, I think it was like 5,000, 6,000 years ago, the English Channel didn't exist, or there was very little there. So between modern England and maybe Norway, there was a place called Doggerland, Doggerland. There was supposed to have been a very lush, plentiful hunting ground for ancient man. And then, of course, and before then it was open. But then about 5,000, 6,000 years ago, if I remember right, the water level started to rise. So then people had to move out of it, went into, like, I guess, Northern Europe and England. But that was interesting. Similar thing there. But
yeah, and that certainly would have happened along the Gulf Coast, because if the sea were 50 miles out from where it is now, we would have had Native American villages and things all along the coast that would have been, in not just Texas, but all around the Gulf Coast, that would have had to have been abandoned, when the sea level started coming up. And there are examples of, where people are doing, when somebody goes out to offshore and says, oh, we'd like to drill, a oil and gas exploration well in this location, they're required by law to do a survey of the bottom and do sonar and radar and look for any kind of debris or any kind of archaeological features. And there have been instances where things have been found that look like evidence of human habitation, but it's now covered up by 70, 80 feet of water.
Wow, interesting. So they find like arrowheads, pottery fragments, remains of houses, or like what?
Yeah, it's more just it wouldn't be a direct sampling of the bottom. It'd be more just flying some sort of sonar or magnetometer across the bottom, or some kind of and looking for objects. You'll see like square shapes or round shapes and arranged in a cluster or in a circle or something. And so it's like, okay, well that looks like it's a village of some kind. And now the things like arrowheads and pottery shards and such, those are found more doing archaeological studies along some of our modern creeks and rivers, and there are actually quite a few. There was a story a few years ago when they were doing one of the segments of the Grand Parkway on the west side over there that crossed, I guess we had crossed Cypress Creek or Spring Creek, but they found a pretty significant archaeological site that was, Indian artifacts and probably some burials and things like that. And so, yeah, I found arrowheads on Cypress Creek.
Cool. And let me mention, folks, while we're on the topic, it's illegal to dig for that stuff and remove it. It's in the law. We posted about that recently on the CCERP page on Facebook, but I'll put a link to the law so folks can see. On private land, you can do what you want. On public land, it is the law has a big long list of things. Of course, you cannot dig, remove, blah blah blah, any artifacts, and then because of trouble with some people doing that recently, the game warden's coming down on it. So, and there's actually been some arrests recently. The DA will be coming after you. The game warden will be coming after you. People are watching for it. So, don't mess with the creek. Go for it on private land or something. But, sorry, go ahead.
well, let me ask you this question. And so, what about when, say, on a gravel bar or sandbar or whatever like that, and so items that are just sitting out there in the gravel, is that considered to be off limits?
I think so. I'm not an expert on the law, but from what I read, and people can read it for themselves, or like, talk to the game warden, or like I think Texas Archaeological Commission to be sure, but I think it is because there's
Hmm.
also a law against messing with like gravel and sand, and um, we're in contact with the game warden, find out what
Hmm.
we can do and what we can't, and he was kind enough to um, direct us to some relevant laws. And
Yeah.
one of them was about removing sand and gravel and so on. So yeah, people who go in the creek and sieve and then throw a bunch of gravel on land, they can be um, charged with numerous crimes, not just looking for artifacts.
Okay, it's interesting. I was not aware of that.
So yeah, yeah, me either.
But yeah, so I guess I was always of the assumption that if you go along and say pull up on a beach and there's like an item sitting there on its water's edge, that it was kind of considered to be out of place. It's not, it wouldn't be archaeological significant because it's not someplace where it was first made, or
Hmm.
there's no village nearby, or there's not a village right there to put it into context or anything like that. So,
Hmm.
but no, if it's actually illegal to even move it from where it is, that's good to know, because I didn't know that.
I think so. We'd want to like ask the game warden or an expert for an
Sure.
interpretation to be sure. I don't want to be
Hmm.
misrepresenting things or putting out false
Yeah.
information, but
Right,
from
and
what I
and
read,
and
that's
those
what I thought.
those laws are very legitimate, because I mean, you don't want people out there willy nilly digging up just the banks and trying to find stuff to go sell them or whatever, removing large quantities of material and
Yeah,
for their own private purposes. So
which
yeah,
which
the
which
laws are there for a reason.
which some people are doing along Cypress Creek, which is part of the problem. If they left no
Hmm.
trace, it'd be different. But there was
Right.
massive pits in the woods, like 10 feet wide, like 5 to 10 feet wide by 5 to 10 feet wide, and maybe like a foot to 3 feet deep. They dig it up and don't even put the dirt back. Tearing up roots, leaving this big gap in the ground, like numerous of them. One
Oh
time
man.
there's even some folks out there with a water blaster hose and they were shooting the side of the creek.
Oh man, I had no idea that it was to that extent.
Yeah, it's just insane.
Yeah.
It's just like, and then, they're like, I found a few exploratory digs maybe on the side of a creek. Um, and it was maybe 6 inches, a foot in, and a bike trail was about 3 feet from the edge of this drop off erosion sand cliff. But so it seems like it's not going to be a danger, but there's a potential there to wear away the trail, undercut it, um, and potentially that could injure somebody.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
all kinds of people riding the trail. It's like
Hmm.
um, children to elderly in between, and none of
Sure.
them should get hurt.
Right.
But
Yeah. Well, it's good to know. I have to look into that and see, because I have to admit, I mean, and there I may well I may or may not have ever gone and looked for arrowheads on Cypress Creek. So
yeah,
no, I didn't
no,
do
you
any
have not.
digging. We just were kind of looking through the petrified wood to see if there was anything interesting there. So
Yeah, yeah, that's one reason why I got this group so we can learn about it, be informed, kind of help the area more. Um,
hmm.
and I don't know, maybe I think you can get permits. So if someone does want to do something like that, maybe they can get a permit, and then just as long as they're, um, I don't know if there's got to be a promise that you're going to turn it over to like the historical society or something, and then you can have
Hmm.
the best of both, and you get to look for it, but it's legit. Um, because like some people, um, like on some social media somewhere, I know someone posted something about, well, my family's found a bunch of things and we have this little treasure of ancient artifacts. Well, what are you going to do with it? Like, you know, when they die, they're probably gonna like throw it away in the garbage and like, or someone who goes over their estate. It's like, why? It's a waste. Get it, give it to the historical society, so at least like it can be valued and shown and stuff like that,
Hmm.
or a museum, or
Yeah,
make a
exactly.
museum. But
Sure. Yeah.
or
Well,
just
good to know.
yeah, find it, bury it. But I'll send you a link to the thing so you can like read it for yourself, and then if you think I'm not interpreting it properly,
Yeah.
you can let me know. I'd appreciate it.
No, because yeah, no problem at all. Because I mean, I've heard those kinds of stories before where any kind of artifacts are not to be disturbed. But I always thought it was if they were in context
Mm-hmm.
of other artifacts, because if things just in the float, they've been transported,
Mm-hmm.
downstream and jumbled up with everything else, and it's hard to really tell if something's archaeologically significant or not in that situation.
Yeah.
But if it's kind of goes back to the whole thing about earlier talking about if you look through a handful of sand, you can tell what was upstream. Same thing with these various artifacts.
True. Good point.
If you find some pottery shards in an arrowhead and a gravel bed, well, you know that it had to have eroded from upstream somewhere.
Yeah, true. Good point.
Yeah. So anyway, so let's maybe move on to other topics.
Yeah. But yeah, I know you're busy today and won't keep you too long, but can you talk a little bit about like how old some of our local creeks and rivers are and what we could see along them, the geologic features?
Sure. So the right here locally, we have a number of bayous in the Houston area, predominantly Buffalo Bayou, but we have also Brays Bayou and Sims Bayou and then Cypress Creek and Spring Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And then, going back further south again, you've got Chocolate Bayou and such. And so based on, best available information and looking at map patterns and such, it looks like all of our little local bayous are part of the Brazos River Delta system, as it were. And now none of those streams are connected to the Brazos right now, but at some point in the past, they would have been. And if you look at a schematic of any delta, it'll show, distributary streams coming off of the main river stream. And as that delta evolves, as the sand and mud are deposited, the distributary streams will move based on what's the easiest way to get downhill for the water. So the stream will sweep across the landscape sort of like a garden hose that's turned on and out of control, or what is it? What was that? There's some kids.
I remember that. Yeah.
Water toys, like the Wet Willy or something like that. Or something it fluffs around or whatever kind of thing. So yeah, so rivers will do that, but at a much slower scale. So they go back and forth. They sweep across the landscape, so they create this landscape of alluvial deposit with meander bends and various sandstones and muds and clays and structures and such. So all of these local bayous, with the best available information we have, were part of that Brazos River distributary channel system. And so at some point in time, the Brazos River and Buffalo Bayou were one and the same. So it would have been, or at least, one of the distributaries. So it would have been flowing down through. And then right now its current channel obviously goes down to where it does bypass Freeport. And so all of them are, like our current version of Buffalo Bayou, there's a lot of misconception about that. Some people think that Buffalo Bayou was dug, within the last 100 years by developers to drain Houston.
Wow.
And that's not true. But the bayou existed, in its current location, since the most recent number you could probably throw on there is like 12,000 years ago, which was the end of the last maximum ice age extent, So, but there's evidence that it's been there much longer, because you can see those clays, you can see in the banks, you can see various structures, various ripple marks, and so it's possible that some version of Buffalo Bayou has existed for 100,000 years, 200,000 years, maybe longer.
No, I need more coffee. I'm kind of been a little brain dead, but so let me see. It used to flow into the Brazos, but now it flows into the San Jacinto?
No. You talking about Buffalo Bayou?
And let me see, like Buffalo Bayou and Cypress Creek, where do they flow?
Well, they flow from west to east, and so Cypress Creek and Spring Creek flow into the West Fork of the San Jacinto River.
Okay.
Buffalo Bayou flows into the Trinity River. Well, Trinity comes down. No, it would be the San Jacinto River. I guess it comes in right there at the head of Galveston Bay, where Buffalo Bayou comes in. And so, so now the San Jacinto and Trinity Rivers are their own thing. I'm going to have to do a little investigation as far as like where their origins are. But as far as our local bayous that are all generally flowing from west to east, those are part of the Brazos River Delta distributary system.
Oh, okay. But then, because I was wondering with the water hose analogy, if maybe they used to flow into the Brazos, but now they flow into the San Jacinto, but that's not the case.
Right. The San Jacinto River channels go further north. Like they look like they may actually be part of the Trinity River system, at least the East Fork of the San Jacinto. The West Fork of the San Jacinto possibly could have been part of the Brazos system at some point in the past, but it's I'd have to go back and look at the map to see, but it would have been a much earlier time period. These are Buffalo Bayou, Brace Bayou, Sims Bayou, Cypress Creek, Spring Creek. They're the more recent forms of the Delta system. So they would have been formed over the past 100,000 years. Whereas the West Fork of the San Jacinto, it was part of the Brazos Delta system, would have been from, and again, I'm just throwing a number out here, but it would have been, million years or more when it was getting started. Okay. And then the Trinity is its own thing, because it flows all the way up to North Texas, and so and beyond. So that was coming from uplifts in in North Texas and southern Oklahoma.
And then, did my tired brain remember right? So it's like you say the general Brazos system that our creeks and bayous were in, but they didn't flow into the Brazos itself.
Well, they flowed out of the Brazos. They flow away from the Brazos.
Oh, okay. So
the Brazos River is flowing. It's the big main trunk stem stream is flowing from North Texas and down this direction, and then when you get to the coastal plain where everything's much flatter, then the water won't flow in much of a straight line. It's going to meander back and forth because the level of the ground is so flat, and so the water is trying to find the most downhill path possible, and so you get that as that Brazos is kind of whipping back and forth across the floodplain. It creates multiple distributary channels. So if you can imagine your arm, and you hold your hand out in front of you with the fingers outspread, that's the river with distributary channels. And so imagine the water flowing down your arm and dripping off each of your fingertips.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so depending on how much water is coming down, water won't be dripping off all those fingertips all at the same time. It might go down your pinky for a while, then it'll switch over to your thumb, and then switch to the middle finger. And that as it does that, each of those channels will remain open.
Okay.
To a point, or they might fill up with some dirt at one end, but then there'll be, so there'll be a little channel there, but not connected to the main stream anymore. Now there's enough water in the landscape that even if one of those bayous gets cut off from the main river, there's enough natural spring flow that comes in from the surrounding saturated soils that it'll sustain a flow of its own. It'll creates its own river, basically. It's just a much smaller river.
Yeah, interesting. And then so you think like Cypress Creek and Buffalo Bayou are like the same age, or what?
More or less, I would, you know, I mean, I would say within the same order of magnitude of thousands of years. I would say they're part of the same distributary system and the same genesis. So yeah, I mean, it probably wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say they're the same age.
Mm-hmm. And then they both have. You think they both supported primitive cultures from thousands of years ago, primitive people?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have. Now, I haven't really heard of any, you know, Paleo Indian villages or artifacts being found along Buffalo Bayou, but certainly along Cypress Creek, obviously, but in other small creeks and private property around town. But I mean, it would stand to reason that Buffalo Bayou would have just as much of a settlement possibility along it as any of the others, because there are forests and there's little pools and things. Would have been good fishing, would have been good hunting around there, would have been there's some topography, would have been good for sitting on to have your village there. So, but I've never found, when we stop and look at the few gravel bars that are on Buffalo Bayou, I've never really found any kind of pottery shards or anything like that. And I've never seen anything that looks like that. And maybe just everything's been so disturbed by all the farming activity and things along Buffalo Bayou, it's just not there anymore.
Mm-hmm. And then Buffalo Bayou maybe going through town, like maybe some of the stuff is under concrete now and things like that. It's been like maybe developed earlier and before people really maybe cared so much about the archaeology and would pay attention to it. It was developed earlier than Cypress Creek, so maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it'd be fun to try to find some of these old families that had, farms here that maybe still have descendants that live in the Houston area that, were descended from the people who originally had homesteads along the bayou and such in the mid 1800s. Mm-hmm. And just to find out if they've got some kind of either oral history, or they may well have some, grandpa's or great grandpa's collection of arrowheads that he found, in the field or something, so.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Get a record of what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So, do you think you need to run now? It's about noon. Need to run to get
I probably should.
Yeah.
I've got this little project going on. So, but if you have any other questions, feel free to give me a call and let's talk about getting down the bayou and we can do that video work. Because I think there's, I can also bring some displays too.
Oh, cool.
So some of the questions you asked me today, we might be able to get a little bit better clarification on what I was talking about on some of that.
Cool.
I could catch a low water time.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no. So bring whatever you want. I mean, we can, be good because we can take one of my canoes and just really get in there and take a look at what's out there.
I can bring my phone and drain the battery.
There you go. Bring an extra battery.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Tom. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Great discussion. Like, any last words for folks?
I guess if I had to give you any kind of last parting words here, would be just get out and enjoy the outdoors right here locally. I know that the city of Houston is kind of dirty and crazy and we haven't taken the best care of our green spaces, but what green space we have left is worth keeping, and it's surprising just what's out there. So go take a walk in your local park. Just go down to your local bayou and stop for a second and look at the water and see what's swimming around down there and look at the birds and just get out there and enjoy life right here in your own backyard. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars to go travel to some exotic location to appreciate the outdoors. And especially right now, this time of year, December is and their butts off up north. We're walking around in shorts. So,
yeah.
And but that's it. I mean, it's like I said, I could go on for a while, but I'm going to go and wrap up there.
Yeah, it's good. And then if it's dirty, we'll clean it up.
We'll clean it up.
Effort.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Or call your, find out what city council person is in charge of that area or county commissioner and document what you see and say, look, whether you saw trash that needs cleaning up or if you see something that needs to be protected, document it and contact your county commissioner and say, look, this needs attention. And they often are pretty responsive. I mean, it might take a little while, but actions make actions happen.
Yeah. And the State Historical Society, the game warden, people like that also.
Sure, cool. Absolutely. And if you see somebody doing something they shouldn't be doing, like for example, we have a lot of birds of prey, raptors, hawks, and things that nest locally here.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. And disturbing them is, I think it's a $10,000 fine or $20,000 fine or something like that. So they're highly protected. So yeah, we have red-shouldered hawks that nest in the trees right here in front of my house. And so
beautiful.
They, people gonna get like, oh my God, there's a hawk. It's going to eat my dog. Like, no, it's not, don't worry about that. We have ospreys that are around. I mean, they're, people kind of like, oh man, what's that thing? So yeah, if you see anybody disturbing those things or bothering them, I mean, that definitely, it's, the game wardens will come investigate, or Texas Parks and Wildlife. I mean, it takes a little bit of work to do it, but it's worth doing. I guess the other thing to do if you find injured wildlife, which does happen, whether it's a baby bird or they fell out of that's hurt or a animal that's been maybe grazed by a car that's like alive but has a broken leg or something, or maybe a big mother possum that's been hit by a car but she has babies that are still alive. Don't touch them if possible, but you can get them into a box and take them to the, what's it called? There's a wildlife rescue place over there off Old Katy Road. I think it's Wildlife Rehabilitation of Texas. Great place. I've taken many injured animals that I found there, and they have a great program. It's in fact pretty unique. A lot of states don't have that, and so
nice. And I'll post some links in the show notes to it, make it easier for folks.
Sure.
You can save it in their maybe contacts on their phone or something, have it ready to go in case. But it'll be there. Cool.
Okay.
Awesome. So thanks again, Tom, and hope you enjoyed that, folks. And we will be talking to Tom soon. Sooner the better, but we'll see. So thanks.
All right.
Y'all have a good day.
Okay, we'll have a Merry Christmas Eve and Christmas Day tomorrow.
Thanks. You too. Enjoy.
All right.
Okay.
Next day, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.